Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman history. During the late Roman Empire, the equipment of the late Roman army hardly changed. In fact, the basic equipment of soldiers throughout the ancient and medieval period was very similar until the advent of gunpowder. In terms of armour, by AD 350, virtually every soldier in the Roman army wore armour. Most men wore chainmail, and more rarely, scale armour. The most common finds of mail are chain shirts that covered the shoulders and extended to the waist. Far less common are hauberks that extend to the knee and the full length of the arms. Some surviving examples even have a mail coif to protect their head. Some mail armour included tarouges of leather that were attached to the mail at the waist and shoulders. Chain armour, or lorica hamata, was made of iron or copper alloy links. Each ring passes through the teobrings above, below, and beside it. The ends of the ring were riveted together and assembled in alternate vertical rows of rings. The scale armour, or lorica squamata, also extended to the waist and the shoulders, and could also include tarouges. One example from Moesia Secunda was even made of bronze scales rather than iron. Another type of armour was an anatomical cuirass that was made of either bronze or iron, and often had tarouges, which is what most officers wore. The scales were mounted on cords of linen or leather. Each scale had two pairs of holes. The top holes were used to attach the scale to the linen or leather. The side holes attached to the scales from the previous row, making them overlap. Bronze breastplates with scale or mail features have also been found. Lamellar armour, which has been found before the 4th century and after the 5th, is completely absent from these 2 centuries. This probably reflects the standardization of arms and armour under the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine. During the Theodosian era, Vegetius notes that some soldiers dispensed with their armour and helmets because of the weight. This may have been true for some troops, but most of the army still wore armour, considering that depictions and descriptions of armour continued to be made for infantry and cavalry in the 6th century, and seem almost exactly the same as their late 4th and 5th century counterparts. This indicates that Vegetius had overemphasized the abandonment of armour, and there was no break in its use, simply a small reduction for some units. The Notitia Dignitatum records fabricae producing shields and armour. Marcion introduced a law that banned the export of body armour, and many depictions of soldiers in the 5th century show men in armour, suggesting that a large-scale abandonment of armour after Gratian is bunkum. However, that is not to say that all Roman soldiers and fighters always wore armour, as there are many depictions of men in manuscript illustrations, monuments, mosaics, wall paintings, plates, and wooden carvings that show men both with armour and without, dating to the late 4th and 5th century. Cavalry wore armour similar to the infantry, including helmets, shields, and body armour. Cataphracts, however, wore segmented leg plates and a cuirass or mail armour for the body. Their helmets had a face mask for extra protection. A cataphract has been depicted with shield, but it is unknown if this was true for all cataphracts. Some, but not all cataphracts, had armoured horses. Horse armour was often made of scale or chain armour, but cloth, leather, and felt barding may have also been used despite no surviving archaeological evidence. Light cavalry could have worn armour, but if there is one unit of which armour was not necessary, it would be light cavalry. It is always a possibility that their shields would be smaller too, as light cavalry were meant for scouting and skirmishing, and not for charging into dense formations. Horses were usually provided by the government, but enlisting troopers could bring their own. Horses could either be levied from the countryside, honorati, and imperial horse breeders. It was the responsibility of the tribunus stabuli, later changed to constabuli, to supply the government with all of its required horses. Although Vegetius says that soldiers also abandoned helmets, this argument can be scrutinized by the same analysis as body armor, and the same evidence indicates that although some units may have favored cloth caps, generally helmets were continuously used, created, and depicted in the late 4th and 5th centuries. There were two main types of helmet produced, the main being a helm with a neck guard, very large cheek guards, a protective visor, and a bar near the crown of the helmet. This type of helmet afforded protection to everything except the eyes, nose, and front of the face. Some soldiers are shown wearing mail or scale coifs instead, presumably with something underneath to soak up the shock. The other type of helmet that first appears in the 4th century was a helm made from two separate pieces of metal, with a large fan running down its middle. This helm had a neck guard, which was part of the helm plates and cheek guards. This helm left the ears and much of the face exposed. This type of helmet is called a ridged helmet. The whole helmet has small holes around the edge so that cloth padding could be sewn into it. This would make the ridged helmet more comfortable and provide more protection for the wearer. A small number of surviving examples have traces of silver on the outside. Perhaps the helmets were washed in silver to make them look grander and prevent rust. Why one helmet was used over the other is unknown, but the regularity of both helmets suggests they were produced in the fabricae. Infantry occasionally wore greaves, but their finds are uncommon. These were made of metal or cloth. Perhaps one reason for their rarity is that they were mainly worn by officers, but this is only a theory. Troops used large oval-shaped shields. They were 1 to 1.2 meters or 4 feet long and 0.8 to 0.97 meters or nearly 3 feet in breadth. The anonymous Byzantinus suggested that shields should be 1.6 meters long. These shields were made of planks of wood, glued together going lengthways. The edges were protected by a strip of hide nailed into the board. A handle was cut out of the shield for the bearer's hand to hold, and the boss was riveted on top to protect the centre and act as a weighty bludgeon itself. Depictions such as the Ravenna mosaic of Justinian, historical accounts, and the Notitia Dignitatum give ideas as to how the shields were painted. Although with the Notitia Dignitatum, it is likely that a later copyist invented some of the shield designs. However, the designs in the Notitia Dignitatum do bear some authority, for Vegetius tells us that different units had their shields painted in a certain way so that their comrades could recognize them during battle. This is backed up by Ammianus Marcellinus 1612.6, where the Alemanni recognize a Roman comitatus because of their shields. These large shields were used by both cavalry and infantry. Vegetius adds that these shields had the owner's name, cohort, and century written on the back. Small round shields were also used. However, these were used almost exclusively by the candidati bodyguards of the emperor. Belts were an extremely important part of a Roman soldier's equipment for two reasons. A belt was very useful, and it distinguished a soldier from a civilian. Belt buckles were made of iron or copper alloy and were in 3 different types. Type 1 had a tongue that passed through a hole in the leather. Another had the leather pass over the tongue and fasten by a side extension. The third dispensed with the metal tongue and had the tapered ends of the belt pass through the buckle and attach to the studs either side. This was the most common type of belt. In the 4th and 5th centuries, belts also became broader, 5 to 10 centimeters or 2 to 4 inches wide. Broad belts also had narrow straps which were attached at one side of the belt plate, wrapped around the inside and buckled to another side. Some belt plates could be decorated with gold, or semi-precious gems, like garnets. Belt straps could be very long, so they either dangled from the belt or wrapped around the outside of the belt, the end left to hang down the right side of the hip. Belt fittings, called stiffeners, were needed to stop the belt folding in on itself. One example, called the propeller stiffener, was about 1 centimeter wide and 4 centimeters long. This style lasted until the early 5th century. After the early 5th century, broad belts were replaced by narrow belts. In terms of equipment that soldiers carried, they had a water bottle, blanket, 20 days' ration. They likely carried a pickaxe or some other type of entrenching tool, a tent, and stakes to go with it, and any additional clothing such as spare boots, trousers, and so on. A soldier's uniform would consist of a woolen or linen tunic, trousers, a cloak called a chlamys, and, most importantly of all, boots. Soldiers also carried the Roman equivalent of dog tags. The average late Roman soldier carried 25 to 30 kilograms of weight in total. Tunics extended to the knee and were long-sleeved. Woolen tunics from Dura Europos were woven into one piece with a neck hole. They have a decorative band on the cuff as well as a single, double or triple clavus band which ran over both shoulders, down to the middle of the chest. The decorative part was sewn with a reddish thread, while the rest of the garment was undyed. The Ravenna Justinian mosaic shows his generals in undyed tunics. The essential shape and design of the tunic remained the same throughout the late Roman period, from the 3rd to 5th centuries. Red tunics have also been depicted, such as a 4th century catacomb fresco from Syracuse, Sicily. This suggests that perhaps other colours were used to dye tunics. The Emperor Claudius II is known to have worn red tunics while still a military tribune. See Historia Augusta Claudius 14. The main difference in clothing was the choice of decoration, which could vary. Roundels with scenes or geometric designs were sewn into the shoulders or above the hem, 2 on the front and 2 on the back. These were added during the 4th century as extra decoration. These decorations were either woven into the fabric or embroidered on later. Red tunics had their decorative patterns sewn in black. A phorocomachus was a special tunic or garment for wearing under scale or mail armour. It was made of wool or linen felt. This shirt could have another shirt worn over it to prevent it getting sodden with water, and then the armour would be placed on top. The phorocomachus prevented the armour rubbing against its wearer. Cloaks were commonly worn by soldiers and civilians from the 3rd century onwards, although many peoples in the Roman Empire had worn cloaks before then. The type of cloak late Romans commonly used was a sagum. The sagum reached to the knee and fringes along the bottom hem. It was fastened at the right shoulder, exposing the right side of the body. The Justinian mosaic shows his generals wearing ankle-length, undyed cloaks. Clearly the sagum was not the only design of cloak in use by the 6th century. Trousers were worn by both infantry and cavalry. Cavalry wore trousers that stretched down to the knee, where a footman had trousers that covered the length of the leg. Depictions of men wearing trousers suggest that trousers were fairly skin-tight. Germanic troops wore looser woolen trousers to what the Romans are depicted as having, and were probably most common in European provinces. In the East, long loose trousers were worn. Most Roman soldiers in the late Roman Empire are shown wearing a pileus, trapeze-shaped rounded hat. This woolen hat was fleecy rather than smooth. Vegetius says that Pannonians wore leather hats to get them used to wearing something on their head before they wore a helmet. It seems that the hats Vegetius refers to are quite different to the ones depicted elsewhere. These Pannonian hats were probably similar to the charioteers' crash helmets, which were more like a skull cap, heavier and made of felt. Pilae were particularly popular during the Tetrarchy, since the famous statue of the Tetrarchs shows all 4 of them wearing pillae. The hat is also shown in the Great Hunt mosaic from Armorina Villa and tombstones. Perhaps the soldier's most important piece of equipment was his boots. Caliga were abandoned in the late 2nd century and replaced with either sandals, boots, or shoes. The crossbow brooch was the most common type of Roman brooch from the 3rd century onwards. A good example of one can be seen in the ivory of Stilicho. The tombstone of Julius Ophidius has one too. Gilded bronze examples have been found in Richborough and Lank Hills Cemetery in Britain. Standards held both an important religious and military purpose. They were a good rally point for troops and gave the soldiers and their officers a good idea of where their regiment and their comrades were on the battlefield. Ammianus Marcellinus tells us about when some cavalry rallied at seeing the standard of the Emperor Julian. See 24.18. A standard was the pride of the regiment, and so if a standard was lost, it was a huge humiliation for both the regiment and the army as a whole. This is a military tradition that still exists today, and as late as the Victorian era, British and other European armies still took their standards into battle, much like the Romans. The vexillum standard had a square-shaped piece of cloth, often with a cairo, which was fringed at the bottom edge and hung on a crossbar attached to a long pole. A surviving example from Egypt was painted and had a figure of victory attached to it. Vegetius tells us that aquila or eagle standards were still used in the late Empire. Each century of a regiment carried its own standard as well. Each regiment also carried a Draco standard or dragon standard. These had been introduced by the Sarmatians in the 2nd century and were primarily used by the cavalry, but they were commonplace in both the infantry and cavalry by the 4th century. A hollow dragon was built and a pole was inserted into a hole at the base of the dragon's mouth. With its mouth open, it may have made a sound or action with the wind. Draco standards have been found in Nier de Bieder Fort, also on the Great Ludovisi sarcophagus, the Arch of Galerius, the Arch of Constantine, and in Sidonius Apollinaris' panegyric to Majorian. Although one might think of musical instruments in battle as being more in the age of fife and drum, the Romans used instruments just like their later counterparts to help convey commands in battle. Vegetius says that the Roman army used these sounds so that the soldiers knew exactly what they should do, either halt, advance, pursue, withdraw, and so on. 3 instruments were used by the Romans: a tuba, a long straight trumpet, a cornu, a circular type of bugle, and a bucina, which was a horn, often bound with silver, and the horn was made from a cow or auroch. Both the tuba and cornu are depicted on tombstones and the Great Ludovisi sarcophagus. Procopius states that each instrument could have 2 different tunes played. By the 6th century, however, the musicians could only play 1 tune, so Procopius advised Belisarius that the cavalry trumpet should be used to sound the attack and the infantry horn to sound the recall, as the 2 sounds were quite distinct. See Procopius, Wars of Justinian, Book 6, Chapter 23, Part 23. Most equipment, like uniforms, were produced by the state fabricae. This also meant that large-scale production and trade of military equipment outside of the fabricae was difficult to compete with, if not illegal. Every frontier province in Europe had a fabricae scutaria et armorium. These were the most common form of fabricae. A frontier diocese had 2 fabricae for armour and equipment production. However, it seems very likely that fabricae for other arms, such as arrows and swords, would also produce things like tunics and entrenching tools. Fabricae were placed on road networks and away from the frontiers to maximise efficiency, and keep them secure, of course. For the sources I used for this video, they had not yet found any archaeology that can be identified as a fabrique as of the 1990s, although this may change in the forthcoming years. Both Vegetius and Emperor Maurus mention fabrique in their military treatises, and the Notitia Dignitatum give specific detail of the fabrique. The state organisation of the fabrique was likely an innovation of the Tetrarchy, but like most things from the Tetrarchic period, these fabrique were likely based on pre-existing centres of large-scale military production. There were 20 fabrique in the west and 15 in the east. Clibinari and Cataphractari fabrique had 3 in the east and half of one in the west. This video has been about late Roman armour and equipment. If you would like to watch my video about late Roman arms, please find the link in the description below. I have been your host Daniel Maynard, and this has been Eastern Roman History.